we will explore the underlying causes and motivations behind the persecution and mass killings of the Pontic Greeks, uncovering the historical context and untangling the complexities of this tragedy. We strive to shed light on the factors that led to the brutal targeting of an entire community, that of the Pontic Greeks in the Asia Minor part of the Black Sea. We will also look into the challenges that have hindered the recognition and historical acknowledgement of the Pontic Greek genocide and the conditions necessary for the international recognition of the Pontic Greek genocide. With Professor Stefan Ihrig as our guest, we are privileged to have an expert who has extensively studied the era and key political actors surrounding the Pontic Greek genocide. Professor Ihrig's deep knowledge and expertise provide the necessary context to explore this tragic chapter in history. It is important to note that for any researcher in an academic field to answer questions effectively, they must have a solid understanding of the topic at hand. In this case, Professor Ihrig's expertise in the history of Germany, Turkey, Russia, or USSR and their involvement during that era allows us to delve into the Pontic Greek genocide with a refined perspective. So let me start by asking you, how does the Pontic Greek genocide compare to other genocides in scale and in historical significance?
The whole issue of classifying an act in history as genocide is of course problematic. There is the one side of it, where people try to limit the term genocide to the big cases of mass atrocities. And until recently, there were many who wanted to limit the term to the Holocaust almost exclusively. And this is, of course, not very helpful because it ignores too many other cases. In the middle ground, basically, we have the United Nations Convention, which is very open, actually, if we read it carefully. You do not need to even destroy or murder a large part of a group to have the act classified as genocide. And there are a lot of measures that are taken that are below killing that already are genocidal acts. And then, of course, on the other extreme, a lot of cases are classified as genocide, and that also, is problematic because if everything is a genocide, nothing is a genocide. And then also we are dealing with the field with a lot of terms that are actually euphemisms. So ethnic cleansing is one of them. Ethnic cleansing is a genocidal act. Cleansing is supposed to be something good. And we also know from our past lack of response to ethnic cleansing in the international community that ethnic cleansing has been carried out in the last decades, even with impunity. So we have basically a whole field of problematic cases there. And then when it comes to the late Ottoman Empire, we have a whole hierarchy of different cases of mass atrocities and violence. And for a long time now, internationally, the focus has been on getting the Armenian genocide recognized. Of course, there are so many other groups that suffered in that time period. And it also bears remembering that almost never does a nation state engaged in, or in this case, an empire engaged in genocide target only one group. So also before World War I started, there was already a strong push in the Greek areas of settlement in southwestern Anatolia, at least, to get local Greeks to leave the Ottoman Empire for the Greek state. There is a continuum here. There is a hierarchy of different cases in, let's say, number of people persecuted and also in measures employed, let's say, on a more global scale. Doesn't mean, of course, that one case necessarily should warrant less attention than the other. And the case of the Pontic Greeks has been very, under-researched, hasn't received a lot of attention internationally. As I said, we're even stuck still to have a kind of a global agreement of what happened to the Armenians, the biggest case. Also, other groups are still waiting to have their story told and acknowledged. So, like, one thing I think to understand the late Ottoman Empire and ethnic violence is a look at the map. So the Armenians, again, going back to them, they were perceived as being so dangerous because they basically cut across the ethnic heartland of the Ottoman Empire, of the Turkish redefined Ottoman Empire, from southeastern Anatolia all the way up to the north to the Caucasus. The idea was that if they are able to reach some degree of autonomy, it would lead perhaps to independence, and this would cut off the Ottoman Empire from the whole rest of, the Arab provinces to the south and the southeast. So Greeks also presented a geographical problem. They settled in a lot of areas that were perceived to be as especially dangerous, volatile security issue. So if you just look, for example, at the northern coast of Anatolia, the Black Sea coast of Anatolia during World War I, the Ottoman Empire, logistically speaking, was not really able to sustain itself. To get coal to the Ottoman capital, for example, in peacetime, you would use ships. In wartime, you had to transport it over land, which was a huge problem and actually really impacted the Ottoman war effort because there weren't proper streets. There was no train line you could use. So this already, and this is only the beginning of it all, sheds a light on the strategic and perceived strategic importance of that part of the Ottoman Empire. And then, of course, there was this whole trauma that ethnic minorities, especially Christian ethnic minorities, are highly successful in engaging one of the great powers in Europe, and in the long run might be able to achieve some sort of independence. So they were all potentially viewed as breakaway territories. And in the perception, it didn't even matter, how much of a majority or plurality these groups were forming in these territories. Added to this also that a lot of times the Ottoman government, the center, didn't have the best statistics or numbers to say for sure what are the realities on the ground. So this already, and also the distance, to the Greek state and other powers that might be interested, put them into a very dangerous position from the get-go.
I think you covered, to a great extent, the following question, which is about the underlying causes and motivations that you see behind the persecution and mass killings of the Pontic Greeks. Or would you like to add anything to it?
And then, as I said before, there's an economic factor as well. Never to forget that one too. We are dealing with the period basically from the Balkan Wars until the end of the Turkish War of Independence, with a period of immense, an immense turnover of populations. You have incoming populations that are refugees, also victimized and brutalized to some degree, that have to be resettled. And this, goes on until the end of the Turkish War of Independence. And of course, the population exchange between Greece and Turkey. So constantly you have a need for resettlement, for opening spaces. You also have this long period of warfare. People are impoverished. There is a lot of opportunity in getting rid of your minorities in this time period. That's not something to be ignored as well, I think.
Something that we might not be aware is that the Pontic Greek genocide was the stamp to the long-term persecutions of the Ottomans since the fall of the kingdom of Trabzon, or the Empire of Trebizond, in 1461, with many Turkish citizens today still speaking the Pontic Greek. There seems to be a great continuation since the Empire of Trabzon. Even my great-grandmother, who was born there and fled to Greece later on, she was not referring to herself as Pontic Greek. She was referring to herself as Roman, because the Byzantine Empire was called the Roman Empire. It was the last remainder part of the Roman Empire, which was actually calling itself the Roman Empire and its citizens Romans. There is a lot of discussion around whether there have been records of the people living in the northern part of Asia Minor, close to the Black Sea. Turkey, the modern state of Turkey, claims that there are no records of people having surnames because people started to have surnames in Turkey later on, after the Ottoman Empire, as soon as Turkey was born and became a republic. The truth is that there is written evidence from primary schools and high schools in Trabzon that Pontic Greeks had surnames. For instance, when they had their certificates from high schools or primary schools, they did have surnames, despite the fact that it is claimed there were no surnames used officially in Turkey at that time. I'm not sure if this would be another aspect that could be explored within the field of that era.
So I'm not a specialist on these kinds of documents, but yes, minorities did use surnames in a lot of contexts way before the official introduction of surnames. But even without that, with other markers that you have, birth dates, appearance in birth certificates and other things, you normally are able to trace down the family line. And normally, when it comes to bookkeeping, in regarding to property, there are documents normally. But of course, one of the big problems is that archives have been cleansed, archives have been lost also when local archives were shipped, to other locations or when in wartime. And of course, people who had an interest to make documents disappear. So it's very difficult, to reconnect to that story and, let's say, at least expect that the archival record is as we need it to be, but there is much more in Ottoman archives than we know yet, and much more to be discovered. It will depend. It will depend what kind of issue you are looking for. I mean, one aspect, perhaps to pivot back to one of the previous questions, it is also always, it's not only about economic benefits and property when genocide is carried out, but also when the question is about acknowledging genocide and expulsion and ethnic violence. I think one of the main fears on the Turkish side is, talking too much or researching too much and acknowledging too much on these topics is that, people will want their properties back. And I think this is a real fear that we will have to deal with when it's about acknowledging these things. And of course, it's also a real concern when it comes to the families of the survivors and the people who left. I mean, in other contexts, you cannot just take away property from people. There are very clear rules in all the societies we live in. But then there are these exceptional circumstances where it's perfectly okay, apparently, for people to just lose everything and no questions asked anymore. So, when you ask about archival documents, at least on the Turkish side, I'm pretty sure it's, people immediately have properties in their mind when they answer. And in a lot of places, we can trace, future elites, economic elites and also administrative elites back to this kind of property redistribution. They take over factories, farmland, and become powerful and stuff, It's complicated stuff, isn't it?
I'm quite critical of what us, the Pontic Greeks, have done so far for the recognition of the Pontic Greek genocide. I think we've done too little, and it's already more than a century. I would like to ask you, as an expert in the field of genocide, what challenges have hindered, apart from our inaction, the Pontic Greek genocide recognition and historical acknowledgement of genocide, and how can these obstacles be overcome?
So, as always, it will depend a lot on the people in charge. And as I said before, also what kind of national discourses are, powerful or predominant at the time. I mean, when it comes to genocide remembrance, also not only recognition, there is a lot of times a generational aspect. It took us a long time to basically come to terms with the Holocaust, even in Germany. It took us a long time to record survivors of the Armenian genocide and to note down their story and publish them. There are some remarkable collections where the interviews were only carried out in the 1990s on the Armenian genocide and then published for the centennial. So, I mean, like one thing, and even if, the previous generations are dead already, oral history can be a good thing, to have, students interview Pontic Greek families. How is it remembered? What has been done? I know it's very late, but, it's better to do it now than to never, continue this part of, something that can be done. It's not only about, reconstructing what happened. It's about, how is this memory transmitted? How are families dealing with it or not? This is something we can always do. Yeah, I mean, like I said before, at this moment in time, I think all these recognition issues are a little bit frozen. We're talking amongst ourselves on the outside. There was an opening a few years ago. And if people continue to do great work, and if we, have people working in the archives continuously, then basically we're building the foundations for future, recognition, dialogue, and such. And, I don't know how it is for the Greek Pontic community, but all the other communities do have a lot of young historians going to the archives and doing great stuff, If you say you don't have that, so collect some money and do a scholarship and get somebody to do it.
Well, there's definitely something wrong happening here, because we have historians nowadays speaking about the Armenian genocide, and quite rightfully, but then we have the same historians speaking of the Greco-Turkish population exchange, as if not just the Pontic Greeks, but also the other Greeks that lived close to the coast of the Aegean on Asia Minor, they haven't lived there for thousands of years. So this is something we have to look into. At the end of the day, it's about making justice in history. One last question, Stefan. What are the conditions for the international recognition of the Pontic Greek genocide? As a few last remarks, I know you have mentioned what the balance is geopolitically, or what the great powers of the world really put in their agenda first at their time. Do you have any final thoughts or remarks on what else could help in creating the conditions for the international recognition of the Pontic Greeks?
So I think there are like a few obstacles that stand in the way of the recognition of any, let's say, numerically smaller. It doesn't not nice to qualify and quantify genocide. But all the smaller genocides have to deal with the issue that they are smaller genocides, and that the term genocide basically was invented as a huge warning, as kind of the ultimate expression of evil. So there is a reluctance to apply the term to smaller genocides, because genocide is supposed to trigger the international community into action. And this is a problem for the now, not necessarily for the past, but past and now are connected, because, there are other mass crimes that don't have a label like genocide. And if the label genocide is to make any sense, it should, trigger action. So that's a problem, that, all the lesser, I don't know how to say it in a better way, genocides have to deal with, because the fear is then, what is happening, I don't know, to various groups in Syria over the last 10, 15 years. Why didn't it trigger an armed intervention? I'm thinking also of the Yazidis, but also other groups. So I think this is going to be a problem that's going to stick around. That's not going to go away easy at all. And then the other thing is that, as long as Turkey remains relatively closed as a society, recognition of these genocides, also the Armenian genocide, run the danger of just being a political instrument to punish Turkey at a certain point in time. And that's basically not very helpful to nobody. So, there is basically a scenario when it becomes opportunistic to recognize the Pontic Greek genocide, but doesn't really serve the Pontic Greeks, if you know what I'm saying. And similar question applies. So now a lot of Western countries have acknowledged the Armenian genocide. So now what? What does it help us really? I mean, there is a sense of justice achieved, and acknowledgement, I think, is really crucial, but it's just one step, there needs to be more as a follow-up, So for the Armenian genocide, for example, it needs to be integrated, I still think, into, world history and European history and all the relevant histories for it, for this acknowledgement to make any larger sense and to have any value. And the same goes for the fate of all the various Greek populations, actually, in this long time period. And if I mentioned the term population exchange earlier, that's only because, this is the label that, this time period at the end of it got. And it's hugely important because it's also a precedent for what will happen later in European history in the next decades. It's like when at the end of World War II, the Allies are discussing what to do with the German minority populations around Europe, they discuss the Greek-Turkish case. This is the case now, going forward. So also there, it's an integral part of our, 20th century world history. It's not just isolated to, the groups, that are directly involved in it. So, history, better history teaching, more history telling, perhaps you can find an author who tells a good story for an international audience that's not familiar with it. These things can help.
Well, I think that it is important to take this first step for the Pontic Greek genocide because it is important not just to ourselves or our ancestors or to the Greek history or to the European history or to the world history, but it is going also to enrich the Turkish history as today's Turkish citizens will realize that they have more common ground with their Greek counterparts, that they were part and citizens of the same empire, not necessarily just the Ottoman Empire, and will show how continuation of history happened and why we are at this point today, and if really the current context of history really helps our neighborhood.
I would like to add, you mentioned before, how the Greeks called themselves Romans, and the book that I just finished on Germans and Turks throughout history, I play with this a little bit too, also in order to integrate the region more into European history. I mean, it's not only that today still, domestic, what do you say? Yeah. Greeks inside of Turkey are called Rum in Turkish, Roman basically, and Greeks from Greece are called Yunan. So there is still this difference in Turkish today.
Allow me to say here that the people who call themselves Rum are the Christian Orthodox who do not speak Greek. The Pontic Greek dialect has deep roots in ancient Greek. So they don't call themselves Rum.
I meant the Turkish majority population calls Greeks Turkish Greeks Rum, and did so throughout the 20th century and made this distinction between the two. But it's more, I mean, it does really go back to, the conquest of Constantinople, the time before and after. I think actually, also we need to look around. We also have, of course, the Cyprus issue still. Greeks and Turks, have such an interesting and symbiotic history over the last, almost 800 years or more, actually. Once actually 1,000 years, once the Turks arrive in Anatolia, you could construct a totally different history of togetherness more than enmity. And I do see opportunities there. When I spoke earlier of the 1920s, so one of the German foreign ministers received a Nobel Peace Prize for, for making new ties with France and kind of, coming to terms with the legacy of World War I in the years afterwards. But Ataturk also reached out to his Greek counterparts in this time period, and they also tried to come to a working kind of, cooperation right there in the 1920s already, and 1930s especially. So there is, there are different histories here to explore as well. The German and the French politicians, they got the Nobel Peace Prize. It's quite a shame, that the Greek and Turkish leaders at the time did not, because it was quite an achievement as well, to kind of make initiatives for regional peace in the interwar period together. I think there are different stories to tell, and perhaps we are lucky and we get to tell them.
At this point, I would like to thank you, Stefan, for your presence on this episode. Your groundbreaking research and insightful analysis have illuminated the intricate connections between history, ideology, and the human experience. I'm really happy that we had this opportunity to learn from you and share your expertise with our listeners.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you all for staying until the end, and I hope this discussion helped to inspire you to question the narratives that shape our perception of history.